about law, society, scholarship, and fandom. Welcome to Semantic Shenanigans.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever showing of Semantic Shenanigans, which is a brand new podcast where law, society, scholarship, and fandom collide. I am one of your hosts. My name is Janet Gershon-Siegel, and with me is the Ginger to my Marianne, the Lucy to my Ethel, Shanna Gilkison.
Hello.
So we are new. We are under the umbrella of Busy Little Beaver Productions, which is also the production house for the G&T show, Live, Love, Play, and a number of other podcasts. So I think the first thing maybe we should do is let's do a little socializing, if you like. Give you a little window into our worlds.
We're going to scare them right out of the gate.
Yeah, clearly. I am broadcasting from the Boston location, the secret Boston location, where it is unseasonably warm, which is interesting because usually you get to about Columbus Day and then you put on heavy clothing and you don't take it off until about the Ides of March.
Yeah.
So
relatable. It's I'm in Bowling Green, Ohio right now, which sounds maybe more impressive than it is because we're surrounded by a lot of corn. Like a lot of corn.
Is this corn mazes or just corn?
Corn. Not even in the fun Beavis corn. Yeah, corn kind of way. Like just corn. And it's unseasonably warm here too, which basically made for some beautiful walks through campus today as I was running from meeting to meeting. But yeah, no, normally we'd be strapping on snowmobile suits about now, so I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. It's we're getting good foliage, although I understand it's better in New Hampshire. But then, in the live free or die state, they always say they have better foliage than we do. To give you a little bit of an idea of kind of who I am and my background, I have a really wacky background. I first started off. I attended college and got my bachelor's in philosophy from Boston University, and fell in love with this city and wanted to come back, but it took me several years to do so. In the meantime, because there was absolutely nothing you could do with a philosophy degree in 1983, I went to law school at Widener University in Wilmington, Delaware. And I came back to New York. And so if you hear the Long Island accent coming out every now and then, it's because I was raised in the Huntington Township area. And so I practiced law for about 3 years there. I was working for an insurance company for the most part, doing defense. Very often this was like trip and falls, but I also handled construction cases and product liability. So, people diving off of ladders to get insurance money, I did that. I up and quit in 1990 because I hated it. And kind of in the meantime, I got married, and we moved first to Providence, Rhode Island. We were there for a year, and then to Boston in 1995. And I started off working actually auditing law firms, which was great revenge on a profession I had hated. So I was a road warrior. I was out something like 200 to 250 days out of the year, and I've been to every state except for Alaska and Mississippi. For some reason, got missed in there. I'm not sure why, but I've been around most of the country, and believe me, I've seen airports in most of the country.
Oh, good Lord!
Yeah. Trust me, that's just not the tour that you want to take. Came back here, really hated that, got into IT, and I actually worked in database stuff. That sort of went by the boards after a while because eventually contract to contract, and eventually you're done with this. I went back to school. I went to Quinnipiac University because I had been a community manager for years, even before it was a job title. So I decided I wanted to get a degree in it, and I just got my master's in communications with the specialty being social media. And so currently, and also in the meantime, in 2013, I did NaNoWriMo, which is November is National Novel Writing Month, and I do that every year now since then. But in the first year, Nano is the idea is that you write 50,000 words for a novel within the month of November. And I entered the book that I wrote into a contest, and I won it. And the prize was a one-time publishing contract. So I'm a published author.
Yay!
Yay! So in the meantime, what I do is I write and I market my own work, of course. But I also am currently working for a high-end wedding blog. So I get to look at extremely expensive tchotchkes all day.
Oh my gosh.
So that's kind of me. That's what I do. And hopefully, I know everybody wants to hear me swearing with my heavy duty accent, and I can assure you there will be an accent, but we're going to try to limit on the swearing. We're trying to go for a bit more of a sedate show. Hopefully. Anyway,
yeah.
Over to you.
Mostly because number one, my mom's listening, and number two, one of these days I'm going to graduate and I need to get jobs and stuff.
My mom probably would be cool with it, but hey, no, I'm good with it. So, what's your background?
What's my story? So yeah, I could probably be a one-woman career day, right? I went to Eastern Michigan University for like about 2 years back in the Stone Age after I graduated from high school, and I dropped out after 2 years because reasons. And I had about a 10-year career in retail management, and then like another 10 to 15-year career doing hair. Decided I hated retail, so it was time to do something else before like I just hated myself and everybody else. So I learned how to do hair, and then kind of the bottom fell out of that, especially in the Detroit suburbs where you can't turn around on any corner without being able to throw a rock at a salon, and the economy was tanking, and I just went through a lot of personal life changes, and maybe like an early midlife crisis. So I had another sick of it all moment, and I moved back home with my family. I got into school to basically pick up where I left off 20 years before, and eventually moved out on my own again, and had no idea what I was going to do with my degree. I had double majored in English and electronic media and film studies, but while I was there, I kind of found my passion. I started doing tutoring and supplemental instruction for the film appreciation class, which I loved. And I had originally found video production kind of intimidating, and I ended up becoming a studio rat. So I fell in love with what I was doing, and I graduated and decided that I was institutionalized and couldn't function on the outside anymore. So I stayed for a master's, and now I'm in my second year as a PhD student at Bowling Green State University in the School of Media and Communication.
Yay! Yay!
Yay!
So between the two of us, we're just we have a lot of sheepskin. A lot of sheep have died for our sins. Anyway, I think so. Let's get into our first topic.
Okay.
Oh my God, it's our first topic. So this is fairly timely. That this happened a few weeks ago. David Gerrold. And this is a name that certainly Star Trek fans would know, but possibly other people might not be quite aware of. But most people know the episode that he wrote, which is for the original series in the 1960s. The episode is probably one of the most famous episodes of Star Trek of all time, and it's called The Trouble with Tribbles. And David Gerrold is the writer of that episode, and awesome, massive kudos to that. It's certainly a great achievement, and we don't take away from that at all. However, so here it is, just about 50 years later. And instead, what Mr. Gerrold has done is using crowdfunding, trying to use Kickstarter to write a book. Now, lots of people do this. There's nothing too odd about that. But the book was called "Oh, the Places You'll Boldly Go." And if that sounds familiar, take a couple of words out of that, and you'll get "Oh, the Places You'll Go," which is, of course, a book by Dr. Seuss.
Yep.
So what the intention behind this particular book was to write kind of a mashup. It's hard to say whether it was really intended to be a parody. It was certainly intended to be a mashup of the Seussian kind of genre, the oeuvre. There's a $10,000 word for you. And Star Trek. And there were illustrations that mimicked the look and feel of classic Seuss, the stuff that you saw in not only the places you'll go, but also Green Eggs and Ham, Horton Hears a Who, that sort of thing. Same sort of illustrations. Definitely intended to look a lot like it. It was intended to be the sort of thing that if you opened up the book and you glanced at the illustrations, maybe without really looking that closely, that you would say, oh, hey, it's a Seuss book.
Yeah. And in terms of the parody aspect, he would be, I would imagine, safe in terms of Star Trek because he's using Dr. Seuss to parody Star Trek. But when you take it around the other direction, we really don't have a parody of Dr. Seuss here. What we have is Dr. Seuss as a tool.
Exactly, and because the concept of copyright infringement is not to stifle artists. It's really actually to protect artists. Copyright infringement, or rather copyright itself, is law that goes back as far as the United States has been a nation. It's in the United States Constitution. Okay, so it's there now. Whether you agree with the amount of time that copyright should exist or not, and a lot of that is due to lobbying by large IP holder corporations, including Disney. Whether you agree with that or not, I hope at least that most people will at least recognize the fact that an artist's product it's something of value. And they need to hold on to it at least for a while. Whether that while is long or that while is short, certainly it's an asset, and it's something that people own. And even if it's sold to a large IP holder, it's owned then by them. And what happened is this was on Kickstarter, and when we do the show notes, you'll see the links and everything. This project was on Kickstarter, and then Kickstarter put up a note that basically said, "Sorry, we've gotten what's called a DMCA takedown notice that said, and that came from the Seuss estate actually, and it said, sorry, we're contesting this." DMCA, which stands for the we're making up words now. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is, again, the intention is to protect artists, because one of the things that has happened in the last 200 plus years of copyright in the United States is things have changed a lot. Back when it was first created, if you wanted to copy something, it was an enormous amount of effort. It was very hard to get it right. You had to be an artist by yourself in order to forge what somebody else was doing. But now you can do it with Photoshop.
Yeah.
It's much, much easier and it's cheaper. So the barriers to entry are much, much lower. So the DMCA, the intention behind it, and whether you like the law or not, but the intention behind the law is, again, to try to protect artists and to do so in the digital realm, because in the digital realm, it's so much easier to copy stuff and pass things off as being originals when they're not. And I'm also going to put in some. We have URLs for things like steps that artists can take if they think that that their own work is being pirated. Because I'll tell you, I'm an IP holder, and I would be kind of concerned if somebody decided they were going to write a prequel to what I wrote, or they were going to write a different POV story or something like that. It gets even more interesting, and it gets even more of a Trek connection when you consider another thing about Mr. Gerald. This year, and I don't want to make this the Axanar show, but it is an important case. It is a case that I've been talking about a lot over this past year on the G&T show. And the Axanar case, what happened is, for people who don't know, Star Trek Axanar, it was a fan film, an unofficial production, quote unquote, that was supposed to come out last year. Parts of it came out and were posted to YouTube. And at the end of last year, the IP holders, CBS and Paramount, sued the production and also its sort of head honcho. And the connection here is that Mr. Gerald blogged for them on at least one occasion that I can recall. And he rather famously said, and I quote, "I have no dog in this fight," end quote. Whether he has a dog in the Axanar fight or not is immaterial. No matter what, he's absolutely aware that this sort of stuff happens. He can't possibly say he's ignorant of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that if you've been in the industry long enough, I mean, shoot, it's someone who's participated in fandom and fan fiction for a number of years. You're aware of it, so there's no reason why he wouldn't be aware of it.
And I think he would have to be aware of it also for his own IP, for the things that he owns. He's, I'm sure, every now and then seeing somebody trying to pirate and go off his stuff without proper credit and without proper licensing. So, he can't say that he didn't know. And that gets into the question of what's called willful infringement. Willful infringement can bring with it penalties. Penalties include over $150,000 per penalty, and this is in the United States federal courts. So Mr. Gerald was well aware that this kind of stuff can happen, and he went ahead anyway. Now, I want to take a slight turn here, and another thing that came out just today. Was it just today?
Yeah.
Lucasfilm.
Yeah, the Lucasfilm thing.
You wanna quickly go in?
Yeah, so let me pull this up here. So yeah, Lucasfilm sued a lightsaber academy with a Jedi club over trademark infringement. So someone is running, I guess, I don't know what would we call this, like a fencing school, a martial arts school, something like that. Yeah, and he's basically infringing on Star Wars IP to sell their services and teach young children and even adults to be Jedi Knights. And needless to say, Lucasfilm is objecting to that.
Now, there's a slight difference here between the two, because trademark infringement, trademark issues, the IP holder has to be zealous and they've got to go after them quickly, because if they don't go after them quickly, then stuff can start to fly into the public domain. Copyright can be selectively enforced long as the copyright is good. So that's a bit of a different ball of wax here. But so Lucasfilm did have to act fairly quickly, and they certainly did. And they certainly, they put that, they brought that hammer down. They brought it down pretty hard. But this is not the first time that small companies or services have been sued for things like this. I mean, you see Disney characters painted on the walls of nursery schools, and sometimes they get sued by Disney. And, for everybody who thinks, oh my God, how unfair and how horrible that is, understand it from the perspective of the IP holder. The IP holder in trademark, they've got to get in there, and they've got to get in there fairly quickly, because if there's any implication that this stuff is permitted, then they got big problems, because they're going to lose their very often multi-billion with a B dollar investment in this IP.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, to the casual fan, it might seem kind of unfair, but when you consider, like, say, you're Disney, you own Mickey Mouse, you want to be able to control how Mickey Mouse is going to be used. Like, you don't necessarily want your family-friendly cartoon character to be used to sell drugs or porn or, something of that nature. So when you look at it like that, I would certainly think that the IP holder would be, someone you could have a little bit more sympathy for.
Well, it's also these are large employers. If they lose some of these IPs, then this is almost like a large employer losing money in their investments. Or they bet on the corn futures. There you go. It all comes back. and let's say the market collapses because it's flooded, or maybe there's a scarcity because the weather's been bad and suddenly there is no corn, or very little has grown. Both of those can seriously affect a company's bottom line. And what happens when companies' bottom lines are threatened, the first thing that happens is that people like you and me get laid off.
Yeah. And, one of the things, too, that I maybe want to back up and kind of talk about and clarify a little bit, because you and I, we were talking about the David Gerald thing in the context of parody. And for people who don't know, the reason why that would be important would be because of something called fair use exception to copyright. And the reason that's important is because while copyright is designed to protect artists, it's not designed to inhibit innovation. So there are 4 factors of fair use that basically a court would have to balance to see if an infringing property like David Gerald's book would actually be permitted under law, even though somebody else owns the copyright. So one of the factors is whether or not your derivative work has to do with parody. And so you're probably the most familiar with this in terms of Weird Al Yankovic songs.
Yes.
He does direct parodies, and he does style parodies. And part of the thing with parody is that it has to have enough of the original work in it to be recognizable. Otherwise, there's no point. So that's part of what I was saying earlier about, Dr. Seuss was being used to parody Star Trek. There's plenty of Star Trek recognizable in it. There's plenty of Dr. Seuss being that's recognizable in it. But the thing being parodied is Star Trek, not Dr. Seuss. So that's where things get really sticky for David Gerald, because there's no parody factor for him to fall back on.
And the other thing about parody, we're used to seeing parody as being something that's humorous, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
No, just commentary on it, I guess would be a way to describe it. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And so fair use, other factors in fair use are things like whether a lot of an IP is used or only a little. And the less used tends to be more favorable for the one who's the potential infringer. Also, what is the usage for? if it's for an educational purpose, then very often fair use comes into play and they say, hey, this is awesome, you're cool, everything's great. The court says that with much longer words, and it's all in triplicate, but you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. But if it's a commercial use, then they take a much harder line on it. So if Mr. Gerald had been... if he'd been referencing either Seuss or Trek or anything else for that matter, and he was writing, let's say he was writing his memoirs about his experiences writing for TOS, he'd probably be considered to be under fair use pretty much anywhere.
Right. And, I think that the crowdfunding here is also part of the problem because he's raising money in order to do this. Now, back years ago, and I haven't written it, and I probably never will, but I had an idea for a cute fan fiction story, and it was going to be like Doctor Who told in the style of Dr. Seuss, and I was going to call it Horton Hears a Doctor Who.
Okay.
And, so it was just this, cute story idea. But the thing is that, like, I was not charging any money to do this. I wasn't crowdfunding. It was just something creative out of my own head, a love letter to two things that I like, Dr. Seuss and Doctor Who. And it was just this product of my brain that I was just going to share out there willingly and not really hurt anybody. It's a lot different once you start getting money involved and making it a commercial venture.
Exactly. Money is part of the fair use issue, but it's also part of damages. Yeah. And some of that has to do with what's called, quote unquote, market harm. And what they mean by market harm is basically when was something sold to you as opposed to the IP by the IP holder. Did they lose a sale because of what you wrote or you produced or what or the costume you created or the toy or or the model or anything else? Because that starts to go to that there's an actual harm from what you did. Now, fan fiction, and to give you an idea of how Shannon and I know each other, we actually originally know each other from Star Trek Enterprise fan fiction. And the reason why fan fiction writers tend to not be gone after, and I'm not even so sure anybody has, is, or maybe one, is, yeah, which we're going to talk about at some point. But today is not that day. The reason why fan fiction writers tend to fly under the radar is absolutely because of the profit issue. It doesn't mean that they're not infringing, because God knows they are, and it doesn't matter what they write in their disclaimers. Those disclaimers are trash. They're not worthwhile. But because they're not raising any money, because they're not making any money, because they're not selling their works, they fly under the radar because there's virtually or practically no damages. There may be some, but it would be such minimal damages. What we call in the law, sort of the peppercorn level of compensation. A peppercorn's worth of consideration is what we say in contract law. So, this teeny tiny thing, let me tell you, CBS and Paramount, Marvel, DC, BBC America, et cetera, all these IP holders, they're probably not going to sue you if they're only going to get a buck out of it. Yeah, and, with as many people as doing it, I actually wrote a paper on this, and this is kind of like part of how this show was born, because fan fiction's place in fair use is something that I studied. It actually got me started on my journey as a fandom scholar. And among the reasons why IP holders generally don't go after people who write fan fiction, I mean, number one, it is the money issue. Most fans are broke. They're not going to get anything out of you, even if they win. The other thing is that most of us tend to write under a pen name. Like, very few people know the pen name that I write under. So,
it makes it this whole big process when an IP holder has to find out who, Dewey 62 is and where they live. Yeah, you know what I mean? And so it just kind of, it's at a point where it's more trouble than it's worth. Now you get something like Axanar where they've raised 1.3 million, 1.6 million.
Yeah, I think that the higher figure was the crowdfunding, plus they got money from things like selling patches at conventions. There were some sort of extra things that were going on there.
Yeah. So I mean, when you get into that kind of money, that's gonna get their attention.
Yeah, I think $1 million in any of these respects is probably going to start tripping levers. Now, one of the things that Axanar was getting upset about and was sort of one of their talking points for a while there, and this is to bring it back to Lucasfilm, is that I know that not everybody knows this, but relatively recently, the Star Trek IP holders, CBS and Paramount, came down with a set of guidelines for unofficial productions. It included a number of things such as a limit on crowdfunding, a limit on time. They wanted you to only use licensed costumes and props and that sort of thing. And before these guidelines came down, the Axanar camp was talking a lot about Lucasfilm, because Lucasfilm, they had and they still have, an annual competition for Star Wars fan films. But the two are kind of apples and oranges. Yeah. So, you want to?
you want me to talk about it because it makes me crazy?
Sure, but and we'll remember we're going to try to keep this as a PG show.
Right. Well, I can drift into PG-13 maybe.
Sorry, Shanna's mom.
Oh, she wouldn't care about that. Yeah. So the apples and oranges concept. The thing that people mostly forget is that the Star Wars fan film guidelines are for a contest. So one of the restrictions, I believe, is that the film can only be 5 or 10 minutes long. One of the reasons that exists is because judges actually have to watch these things, and if you have, hundreds, if not thousands of people sending submissions, nobody has time to watch that many feature-length fan films. It just can't happen. So the time limit kind of serves a dual purpose. Number one, in terms of keeping the contest manageable, but also, to a point, it does kind of protect their IP in that it can't replace the original IP in the mind of a viewer or confuse a viewer into thinking that it's official Star Wars. But largely, I think that that's more for the comfort and convenience of the judges. The other thing about the Star Wars IP guidelines is when you submit your fan film to Lucasfilm's contest, you are basically giving them ownership of your film.
Yes.
So basically, you've made this film, but they own it. And so that's a little bit different than fan films that exist outside of a contest. And there are still Star Wars fan films that exist outside of the contest, and they have to play nice just like everybody else. Keep their heads down, don't make any money, don't trip any radar, and just share freely and don't profit from the IP.
Yeah, and once again, the word profit or rather, market, market, positives coming to somebody or personal financial benefit. There's the word. Those things that's the sort of thing that is going to start really tripping people's IP holders' radar. Is when a fan is starting to make money off of their IP, because, and because people had asked me today actually about cosplayers. And for the most part, cosplayers are perfectly fine because they're considered basically just to be fan expression. Now, are they infringing? Yeah, they probably are. But, particularly if they're making their own costumes and they're not buying this stuff from licensed vendors. But at the same time, again, IP holders are not going to be suing them unless they can see that somebody's making serious money off being a cosplayer. And there are people who are professional cosplayers and who might even be making some money from signing autographs and whatnot, and selling photos. But until those people start to trip like millionaire status, most IP holders are probably going to be kind of okay with it. There is certainly an advertising factor involved.
I just wanted to add too, there's other situations where money comes into play that kind of stay under the radar. For example, I'm pretty old school. I've been doing fan fiction since the day of fanzines. And for those of you who aren't old enough to know, this is how we shared fan fiction and fan art before the internet. It had to be printed on paper. Sometimes it was photocopied. Even before that, it might be from an old used ditto machine in somebody's garage. But this is how we did things. And because physical material supplies were required, they cost money. So what a fanzine editor would do, like once they got all of their story and art submissions and everything, they would figure out how much it cost to print it. And so basically, if you wanted to read the zine, you had to buy it. Now, most zines stayed under the radar because nobody was making any money from it. Any money brought in generally went into the physical production of the zine. Most of the people who knew about the zine, it was kind of an open secret. Wasn't something that you would walk into a bookstore and get. You had to know people, or maybe you saw them at a convention, that kind of thing. But generally, zine editors lost money. A lot more of their own personal money would go into it than what they made back out of zine sales. So that's also kind of where things get a little slippery with money, because fandom has this long tradition of, you have to pay some money for the pleasure of reading and writing fan fiction. But again, it's not that there's no personal financial gain involved with that.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a slipperiness sometimes to fan fiction hosting sites that might occasionally pass the hat a bit because hosting is not free. So there's some areas where an IP holder might be a little concerned. But again, unless these people are living in style and are flouting a lavish lifestyle about this stuff, then they're probably going to be okay. Again, and because I'm a lawyer, I have to give a disclaimer here. I am not your lawyer, and if you have real questions and you really think you might be in trouble, please contact a lawyer and in person, and pay somebody some money for a consultation.
Yeah, and for my part, I got an A on my fan fiction and fair use paper, but that's all I can give you.
You got everything I've got. Do you want to move on to our next topic?
Yeah, we can. Which one is that? We jumped around a little bit.
Oh, T versus T.
Oh, yeah. Trek versus Trump. All right. Do you want to introduce that one, or?
Sure. Just a second.
Okay.
All right. So you have to kind of be living under a rock to not know that this has been a big-time contentious campaign and election year. And in fact, it's been pretty much an election 2 years. This thing has been going on forever. It feels as if we've had this election since the year one. Fortunately, it hasn't been quite that long. Be that as it may, if you're on Facebook and you run particularly within the Trek circles, you've seen a group being shared. Actually, it's a page being shared by professionals and amateurs alike. And this is called Trek versus Trump. Yeah.
I gotta tell you something, too. So I was looking to find their Facebook page just so that I could reference some things, and there's actually a Trek for Trump group. It's a closed group, and there's only 4 members in it.
Oh.
Isn't that cute? They tried.
It's a little sad. So, well, the Trek versus Trump page has, at least when I looked the other day, it had a little under 30,000 likes. That's nowhere near the biggest page on Facebook. Some of the biggest pages on Facebook have millions and millions of likes. Things like the official page devoted to Lady Gaga, for example.
Yeah.
And I think even George Takei probably has way more followers than this. So it's not a huge following. First thing I want to do is I want to read off a selection of the names. I'm not going to read every single one of them, but let me back up a little bit. This all started with a post. And the post was basically a manifesto. And it said 2 big things, said it with a few more words than this, but the 2 things it said were, number one, we just can't stand can't stand Trump, and it's because of certain Trek values, including IDIC, which stands for Infinite Diversity and Infinite Combinations, and they cited things like statements against Mexicans, statements against women, that sort of thing. But furthermore, they also didn't take a stand in terms of endorsing a particular candidate. They really just said, we just hope you don't vote for Trump. They didn't say, please vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein or Hillary Clinton or anyone else, or Vermin Supreme for that matter. So I'm voting for him because I want a pony.
Right.
He's the only one who promises ponies, folks.
Have they stopped writing in Gus Hall? Did that finally stop?
Pat Paulson, if he was still alive, I would be voting for him. For those who don't remember, Pat Paulson was a stand-up comedian, actually, but from the days of Laugh-In, so from like the 60s, and he actually did used to run for president every year, like clockwork. But I digress. So this manifesto was signed by a number of Trek luminaries, and so I'm going to just read off a bunch of these names, but not all of them because that'll take us forever. So first up, this is in alphabetical order by surname, and not only because that's a nice way of organizing things, but it's also because of this first name that shoots right to the top. Man, this is lucky serendipity, because the first name on this list is J.J. Abrams.
Yeah. Putting J.J. Abrams at the top of this was absolutely calculated, because they could have organized it other ways. They could have put the movie people in one place and the TV people in another, and maybe they would have separated out by series, or they could have put the book people together or whatever. But instead, he got put up to the top, and for damn good reason, because he's extremely well known. René Auberjonois is on this list. He was on Deep Space Nine. Scott Bakula from Enterprise. Brandon Braga, who is like a showrunner from the background of a couple of series. LeVar Burton, a lot of people know who that is from TNG. John Cho from the newer movies, the Kelvin Timeline. Keith R.A. DeCandido, who is a licensed tie-in writer. Michael Jan Friedman, who's also a licensed tie-in writer. Dominic Keating, also from Enterprise. Walter Koenig from the original series. Justin Lin from the most recent film, Star Trek Beyond. Gates McFadden from TNG. Robert Duncan McNeil from Voyager. Nicholas Meyer, who was the director of Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan. He's also the director, or the showrunner, I think it is, of the series that's coming out next year, which is called Star Trek Discovery. Anthony Montgomery from Star Trek Enterprise. Ronald B. Moore. Kate Mulgrew from Voyager. Yep, who I met over the weekend.
Yeah, I know. The redhead meets the redhead. Yeah, they're wonderful, wonderful Kate Mulgrew. Larry Nemeczek, very well known. The two Nimoy children, Adam and Susan. Simon Pegg from the Kelvin Timeline films. Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, also from those films. Eugene and Heidi Roddenberry. Eugene, he's also known as Rod Roddenberry. He is Gene Roddenberry and Majel Barrett's son. Or I'm sorry, he's Gene Roddenberry's son. I don't think he's Majel's. Brett Spiner from TNG, Marina Sirtis, also from TNG, George Takei from the original series, Connor Trinneer from Enterprise, Carl Urban from the Kelvin Timeline films, Will Wheaton from TNG. So
this is like a who's who of Star Trek that have signed this open letter.
Yeah, it's an incredible list, which is way longer than the people who I just listed. Obviously, this got a lot of attention. Hollywood Reporter reported on it. That's the link that I'm going to be putting into the show notes. Why do you do it this way? One of the reasons is because it's a kind of synergy. It's a social synergy, actually, because if just George Takei comments on this, it's helpful, and he's got a lot of followers. But there's much more social reach if 2 dozen, 3 dozen or so more people also are talking about the same thing, because then it starts to go onto Facebook and starts to become a trending topic.
Yes. And I'm sorry, there was something that I wanted to say about that, and train of thought derailed. There were no survivors.
Well, it happens. It does add more cachet to some of these lesser known professionals. So it might pull some other people into the mix, such as Mr. DeCandido, who is well known in the circles of people who read Trek books, but may not be known quite so well to the general public. So there is kind of a marketing aspect to this as well, whether people want to admit it or not. It is there. There is also sort of this safety numbers, this strength in numbers when Scott Bakula just puts something on his wall, it might seem like one person's opinion, but when it's a bunch of people, then it starts to feel more like a movement. Now, what I'm seeing also is 2 other opinions of this. Actually, I'm seeing 3 separate opinions of this. One of them is, rah, rah, this is awesome. Yay, go.
Yeah.
This is wonderful. That's one thing I'm seeing. Another one I'm seeing is from people who are Trump supporters, who feel that the fandom has let them down, who don't feel like they belong in the fandom anymore. I can absolutely see their POV. I feel badly if they feel that way. Missing from this group are, among others, actor Gary Graham, who was on Enterprise and who is a conservative. I'm sure he would never sign a letter such as this. And he's, of course, as much of a Trek professional as anybody who signed this missive. But there's also a third school of thought, which isn't necessarily on one side or the other. But the third school of thought is saying, well, we're really not so happy about the co-opting of the Trek brand for this. That's kind of an interesting POV, I felt.
Yeah, I mean, and I can kind of see the point of that. On the other hand, though, and I just have to answer as a fan here because, obviously I'm not a lawyer, and as far as any legal ramifications of co-opting the Trek brand to do this, it's something that I've often wondered myself in terms of, okay, you have this certain basic philosophy of Star Trek, and there are certain elements of the fandom who obviously either don't follow or understand that same philosophy. I'm sorry, I just got walked on by a cat.
This is an occupational hazard here, folks.
It is. So, on the other hand, Star Trek has, it's just something that it's very known for, and something that we all just kind of understand. has always been the basis for establishing active fandom as we understand it today, because of fans who believe in the philosophies that Star Trek stood for and the social issues that it combated, with the hope of making planet Earth in a better place to live. So, as a fan, I guess I would say, has the brand really been co-opted, or are these people just saying, hey, maybe it's time for Trek to do what it says?
And it could be. I mean, I think that no matter how you feel about this or about the election, or even whether or not you're an American citizen, I think that we can all come to the agreement that all of these people have freedom of speech, whether it's, guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, or maybe if some of them are citizens of other countries, many other countries guarantee you freedom of speech. And they didn't just give that up because they became artists. They didn't lose their ability and their freedom to speak out on social issues that are important to them just because a camera got trained on them, or they started to sew a costume or paint a set. So I think most of us are cool with the fact that these people want to express themselves, but they may not be so happy about how it occurred. The other thing about Trek and politics is that Star Trek has always been political. That's the thing too.
Yeah.
Is that there's always been politics, and there's always been controversy. Nichelle Nichols ends up on the bridge of the Enterprise not only because she's a breathtakingly beautiful woman and a good actress. She's also on the bridge of the Enterprise because she's a woman of color. And the same is true of George Takei. He's on the bridge of the Enterprise not just because he's a good actor, he's got good chemistry with other people who act in the series. It's also because he's a man of Asian extraction. And this is also why the Walter Koenig character, Pavel Chekhov, was created and added because to add a Russian onto the bridge in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War was a major political statement to say, we're going to get beyond this. We're not going to be enemies forever. And of course, the Berlin Wall falls, 20 or so years later, and people are saying, hey, yeah, they were kind of right here.
Yeah.
We see other controversial episodes, not just in this series. Everything from there's an episode in TNG, and God, I'm totally blanking on the name of it, where Riker falls for an alien who comes from a society where they don't really condone anybody having a gender. There's in Enterprise when T'Pol contracts a disease where she's being shunned by other Vulcans. Deep Space Nine, where they are commenting on torture and espionage, and they comment on torture in TNG as well. We're in Voyager, where Janeway makes tough decisions sometimes that aren't necessarily what we would consider to be moral, but she's doing it for another purpose. So there's always been something that's philosophical. There's always been something kind of edgy. There's always been something kind of political, even on top of pointy-eared forehead aliens. There's more to it. It's not just they're coming to eat us. They're coming to attack us. So for people who are involved with Trek to feel that they want to make a political statement, particularly in this, of all elections, this extraordinarily contentious and never-ending election, almost follows suit. You sort of wonder why they didn't do it before.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that some of these political things, Star Trek has always been an allegory for the human race as it is right now, and particularly the United States, because the show is made, by Americans for American TV. So if you look at the type of issues that Trek took on and the philosophies behind them, build a wall is not one of them. That would be something that one of the bad guys would do. sexual assault is something that the bad guys would do. I mean, there was this whole, they've taken on sexual assault. Basically, there was the episode where Deanna Troy was basically mind raped. I mean, the whole episode was an allegory for rape and sexual assault against women. And Trek has
that one. I remember.
Yeah. So, Star Trek has established that these are bad things that we don't want in our society. So it kind of baffles me that people are surprised and upset that this would come up.
Maybe they, that this just sort of came, I don't know. I can't get into people's heads, so I don't know if that they feel that this was manipulative, that it was a little too slick. Maybe they felt that, but I mean, this is how a message is spread. A message is, it's very hard, and I'm saying this as a social media professional, it's really hard to spread a message when it's just one or two people doing it, because the algorithm won't pick up on these social signals, but the algorithm picks up on stronger social signals. And one of the ways it does that is if not just one of your friends is writing and sharing something, but if a bunch of your friends are. So when you start to see these signals of 16 people liked X page or 23 people shared Y post or whatever, those tend to shoot up a bit higher because we all get this tsunami of data every day, and particularly on Facebook, it just sort of gets thrown at us constantly because the average number of friends on Facebook is something like 1,300, and I think that number is getting higher. And some of that, understand, is that the millennials are juicing those numbers so that they're really riding that wave. But still, even if you're older, a lot of people have at least a good 500 friends. And if you, or let's say 600, which is an easier number for this, if you go on Facebook only 1 hour per night and you've got 600 friends, then you've got 1/10 of 1 minute to see something for each of them. And that's never going to happen. So instead, what they do is they aggregate. So you see aggregation, and aggregation gets better ranking of this stuff. It's the same as on Google when certain things are ranked higher because of the way that you put together a web page. Google's job, its purpose, its business plan is to give you the best possible search experience, and that means the best possible search experience is that you find what you're looking for as soon as possible, most likely on the first page. Facebook's business plan, its hope for you, its real business plan is to sell your eyeballs to advertisers, but the other piece of that is the way that they do that is to give you as good a social experience as possible so that you'll stay. And one of the ways that they do that is they try not to make it so that you're constantly having stuff thrown at you. Oops, sorry about that. I hit my mic. You're constantly if you have less of this stuff thrown at you, most people are a lot happier, because if it's coming too fast, then people say, well, I can't keep up with it, and they'll eventually, a lot of them will just sort of give up and walk away. So instead, they go with a much more complicated algorithm, and that includes this sort of social aggregation. So when you have this group here, the other thing is this group got together, and these people are, for the most part, I would say, they are admired by Trek fans. And a lot of them are admired by other folks as well. I mean, Carl Urban was in other things. Zoe Saldana's been in other things. Justin Lin, he directed the Fast and Furious films. These are professionals who've done things that aren't Trek also. And so there's a reach that goes beyond Trek fans.
Absolutely. And, wow, train of thought derailed again.
I think
this isn't my night. I'm sorry, everybody. Yeah, so I don't know. It just, it's kind of become a movement unto its own. And like it or not, it's here. And, I don't know. This might be a good segue into problematic fandom.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Let's do it.
So last weekend, I went to MPCA, which is the Midwest Popular Culture Association conference, and I was there to present on a paper about smutty X-Files fan fiction. Which
that's awesome, right there.
I know, I love my job, right? So in addition to presenting, of course, I was in other panels and listening to other presentations. And one phenomenal presentation that I listened to was by a scholar named Carrie Lynn Reinhardt. And she was talking about fractured fandom and basically power distribution and like how power factors into fandom fractures, defensiveness, things of that nature. And it was actually during one of her question and answer session, or one of her question. There was a question and answer session after all three panelists delivered on their papers. And one of the things that she said during the question and answer was that, you know, one of the things that we'd be happier if we knew is that it's okay to love something that's problematic as long as we're willing to engage that and grapple with how it's problematic. So, you know, yeah, maybe Trek against Trump is problematic. Maybe Trump himself is problematic. And, you know, if you want to support Trump, that's great. But instead of, you know, going into this, you know, this tribal sense of denial, grapple with how he's problematic, acknowledge that, and you know, focus on what you think are his good qualities. Same thing if you are in Trek against Trump. You know, we just talked about a couple of ways that it might be problematic tonight. If you want to belong to that organization and you really think that it's right, and yes, it aligns with Star Trek's philosophies, that's great, but acknowledge and grapple with the fact that, you know, it's not perfect. There is a set of problems that come along with that, and they need to be part of the conversation.
Well, you know, I mean, it's the same sort of thing when we fall in love with somebody. You know, we have this honeymoon period where it's, oh, everything's wonderful, and then you know, and then you know, time sort of passes and you realize, you know, the way they pick their teeth is not that cute anymore. You know, or whatever it is. You know,
right.
there's always some pet peevey kind of thing that goes on, and there's an imperfection. I mean, we as fans, you know, one of the things that we've seen, we've both experienced this with Trek, and I've actually experienced this also as a member of Red Sox Nation, is where there's very often there's a conflict within the fandom. You know, you know, are you a better fan? Are you a more important fan? Are you a longer term fan? But you know, or that certain fans want one thing and other fans want another, and they want to co-opt the narrative. They want to say, oh, well, the fans want, quote unquote, but you know, there's however many million fans, and you can't possibly have everybody's opinion involved in this. I mean, if television programs, for example, were to do exactly what fans wanted, we just have reality TV 24/7, which we practically do.
Right. And you hit on something that, you know, Dr. Reinhardt was talking about in her presentation, in terms of, you know, certain hierarchies develop within the fandom, and a lot of that just happens because maybe one fan or a group of fans gets more listened to than the others, and they start policing the fandom, and they start trying to be prescriptive about what's appropriate in the fandom and what isn't. And sport is a really common place where we see this, but also I think that it's particularly toxic in media fandoms like Star Trek and Star Wars and maybe Harry Potter, although I haven't participated in that one, where you have a group of people who previously have been very marginalized. I mean, it's only been within the last 10 to 20 years that fandom has been mainstreamed enough that, you have regular people going to Comic-Con and all that kind of stuff. But before, it's like everybody thought that we had, broken taped glasses and pocket protectors and lived in our parents' basements. So
we don't.
Well, I mean, some of us do, but I mean, I think some people who aren't in active fandom also do that,
Oh, that's true too. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no. So, because we've been have this history of marginalization, it makes us super sensitive and super defensive when we have disagreements, differences of opinion, and misunderstandings within our fandom.
And we have all sorts of weird misunderstandings within fandom. I mean, when TNG came out, were there people yelling that, "Oh my God, that's not real Trek"?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I was at the first Star Trek convention in Detroit after it was probably just 2 or 3 weeks after Next Generation debuted, and there was all kinds of crazy my captain can beat up your captain kind of stuff, and I even think that I recall a physical scuffle happening at some point. It was insane, and of course this was not too long after the New Coke debacle. Do you remember
oh my God, New Coke and Old Coke! What a marketing disaster for Coca-Cola.
Right. So they brought regular Coke back as Coke Classic, right? So there were these Trek T-shirts, and this would be an interesting case for infringement because I don't know how much licensing went into this, but there was Trek T-shirts that said Trek Classic on it in the Coca-Cola font.
Oh yeah, There's a question there, and obviously it's intended to copy it.
And this was 1987, so who knows if any of this stuff is around anymore, or if those answers exist. But so we had a case of toxic fandom back then. But when we talk about being able to and willing to engage in something that's problematic. I had an example happen to me within the last week in which, I got into a verbal, I don't want to say altercation, but maybe disagreement with a fan at a community who was basically viewing Gene Roddenberry through rose-tinted glasses and using that point of view to basically say that fans should be able to do whatever they want because Gene would have wanted it that way. And I'm thinking, okay, how much about the man do you know? I mean, we have this insane idea that people who have achieved great things somehow have it all figured out more than the rest of us do. Whereas in reality, they had their problems, they had their flaws. We know that Gene was a womanizer. We know that Gene was a businessman above all. And yes, he looked for many, many opportunities to cash in. So his fan-friendly attitude does not mean that he would condone infringement. And I had actually provided a whole bunch of evidence as to why that is, because I'm a scholar. That's what I do. If we make claims, we have to support them.
Absolutely.
And she got actually rather offended at me because she would not grapple with the fact that, this person that she's putting on a pedestal and using that as evidence for why fans should be able to do whatever they want and, copyright infringement be damned. She was not willing to grapple with the fact that, hey, there's something problematic here.
Well, I mean, when I was in 12th grade, I recall my English teacher telling us, before we started, at one of the first days of class, she said, this is an advanced placement class, and we're going to be talking about Shakespeare here, and I want you all to know that Shakespeare wrote for money.
Yep.
And it's a thing that sort of, knocks a sort of knocks the supports out from a pedestal. I mean, we want to believe, I think a lot of people want to believe that Gene Roddenberry had a certain, that there was something about him that was, philosophical and good and wonderful. And I'm sure there was a lot that was. But at the same time, he wrote lyrics to the TOS theme songs so that he could get a royalty check. He created the IDIC symbol so that he could sell it. This stuff exists because he was, he wanted to market this stuff. He wanted to make some bucks.
Absolutely, and when we think about that, though, we have to understand that doesn't undermine the fact that IDIC is a wonderful idea, and if that's something that you want to ascribe to and incorporate into your own life, that's fantastic. The fact that he created that symbol so that he could market it does not undermine the idea that it stands for.
Exactly. There's, just one is a symbol of the other.
But we have to be willing to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, he did, do that just so that he could make a buck.
Yeah, he's not Saint Gene, and that's, I think, there are some people who sort of feel that way, and they need to be reminded that was not his persona, either public or private. He wasn't. He was a human like you and I.
Yeah, and you kind of almost have the polar opposite in the Star Wars fandom, because it's just, from my experience, people love to hate on George. I don't know what the idea is there. It just, on the one hand, they give him mad props for, creating something phenomenal, but on the other hand, he is a sore subject for a lot of people.
Is it Jar Jar? Is that it?
I think it's Jar Jar, but I think it's also the fact that he would go back in and tinker with the films. I mean, come on, why do we have to have Han shot first T-shirts? It's because he went in and tinkered with it and made Greedo shoot first in the special editions, and that just sort of changed the whole narrative of who Han Solo is. So there was a lot of resentment over that, actually, and I often compare the enhanced Star Trek to the Star Wars special editions. The enhanced Star Trek didn't change plot or character; it just made everything look better. It improved the aesthetic, whereas George went in and changed plot, and also a lot of his changes were useless. Like, okay, he added a monster just so we could hear it burp or fart.
Yeah, well, and this is also a cashing in on this version and that edition and whatnot. Let's get that back in the theater again and see what else we can milk out of this.
Exactly, and it added value in terms of, making George Lucas more money, but it didn't add value to the visual presentation, really, or the story. Whereas I would argue that the enhanced Star Trek adds aesthetic value.
And I think that the enhanced Star Trek also can very often make make TOS in particular much more reachable, more relatable for a newer generation. That it's less cheesy special effects, and so those sort of fade into the background, and you concentrate more on the story, which is really what you should be concentrating on. I think a lot of folks may not quite appreciate what was done with sort of chewing gum and tape and, a little fuzz and glitter and whatnot. And, because they didn't have the budget and they didn't have the technology. And, those props are made of wood and plastic and paint and glass, because that's what they had.
Yeah, and having had the experience of working on a no-budget horror film myself a couple of summers ago, let me tell you, that experience makes me especially appreciate how much Star Trek did with so little back in the 60s.
Well, and you see this particularly in the third season when they really didn't have a budget and, minimalist sets and whatnot. But minimalist sets can often be truly compelling. This is where you quite literally allow the audience to use their imaginations, and that's kind of neat to not have things spoon-fed to you. But it doesn't mean that the effects that came later in the films and in later series, this is not to detract from them by any means. Certainly the CGI that we saw in Enterprise, some of that is somewhat dated now and probably could use some freshening. But to see a Gorn on the screen that moved in a way that felt realistic was great. To see a non-bipedal species, the Tholians, in a way that was believable was a thrilling thing. And so, we as fans, we look at it in a lot of different ways, and as the works are retooled a bit, and also, let's face it, also as the Kelvin timeline continues to come to life, and we see new takes on this, that, I think that we get a new perspective on our fandom and on the things that we love.
Yeah, and I think that part of the thing too, like part of the objection to the Kelvin timeline has to do with maybe feelings of disloyalty to the original if you actually admit to liking it. I kind of feel like it might be similar to, like, say, I don't know, like losing a significant other and then having reservations about falling in love again. I think that there might be a little bit of that going on, but when you think about it, like for all the complaints people have about the Kelvin timeline, and I mean, on the one hand, I'm kind of glad that the Kelvin timeline came along because before that, Enterprise was the redheaded stepchild of the fandom, and now people are not only like leaving it alone in terms of dogging on it, but like they're actually giving it a chance now and like saying that they like it. And I just kind of like, every time I see that, it's like, half of me is really grateful that, yeah, okay, great, you're seeing what I thought was so great about this show, but then there's this other half of me that's going, you idiot.
I'm usually saying it's about damn time.
Yeah. So, we can pretty much all universally agree that we love TOS and probably TNG, but both of those series were flawed. I mean, I don't care how many different ways you cut it up. Both were problematic in their own way, and both maybe didn't age as well as we hoped within the first 10 years of their airing. After that, things start looking kind of dated. Our society has changed enough that we're like, okay, well, maybe we missed the mark there, or, even sometimes things end up downright cringeworthy, but somehow the older ones, we can excuse that and, oh, well, we've just learned to love it, warts and all, which means that, okay, we can acknowledge that it's some of us acknowledge that it's problematic. Others just kind of put it on a pedestal without even acknowledging these problems. And I think that that's where we get into trouble as fans, and I think that it right there is where it gets wrapped up in our sense of identity as fans. It's like, okay, well, if we admit that this thing is imperfect and that we love this problematic imperfect thing, it means that there's something wrong with us, and that's just not true. In fact, quite the opposite. If we can talk about these things and admit these things, I think that means that we're even better. And if you're kind of trying to think about this in terms of what Gene would have approved of or not approved of, I think that he would rather us talk about it and acknowledge it.
And to still be talking about it 5 decades later is a tremendous achievement, no matter what. Just to throw out, also, we keep talking about the Kelvin timeline. For anybody who is unaware of what that means, that is the J.J. Abrams, for the most part, films from 2009 to the present, which star Chris Pine, Zachary Quino, etc. I think a lot of people. I remember before those came out. I remember on a fan site, on a forum, somebody saying nobody else can ever play Captain Kirk ever. You didn't say it quite like that, but that's what I got from it. And I remember responding and saying, if we thought that, then we would never see. If we thought that certain characterizations would be so 100% iconic that they could never ever be recreated, then something, we would never see Macbeth on stage. We would never see an opera, for example. All of these older IPs, I guess you shouldn't even call it an IP anymore, because these things that are in the public domain, those would never be staged again, because, oh my God, how could you possibly do any better than, Joe Actor from 1750?
Or let's talk about, even more recent franchises like James Bond.
Yeah, how can you do better than Sean Connery? How dare you? How dare you? Or
look at how Doctor Who worked around that.
And that was brilliant, actually, and it's a similar what they do with the Trill. What the franchise has done with the Trill is you can have a different face, and that there's an in-universe explanation for it.
Yeah, so, we have all of these franchises, Doctor Who, James Bond, even, the classics like Macbeth, and we can love the new incarnations, like we're okay with that. Well, actually, Doctor Who, some people get a little salty when their favorite doctor gets replaced, and, I think that there's going to be a certain faction of fandom that's always going to resist change, but eventually most of the fandom looks for things to appreciate about the new actor, or the new situation, the new interpretation. And it's just so funny to me that in Star Trek, people resist that so hard.
I mean, how many times has Little Women been staged?
Right.
Jo was played by Katharine Hepburn. It's been played by Susan Day. She's been played by Winona Ryder. Are any of these better than others? I don't know. Are any of these worse than others? I don't know. But they're products of their time. And they're all valid interpretations. How many times has Jane Eyre been staged? How many times has Hamlet? And all the new and different ways that these things are interpreted and reinterpreted. If we didn't want to see reinterpretation, then you might as well delete any copies of West Side Story that you've got.
Oh yeah, and you know what? Let's even think about like a classic film like Sabrina. Okay, Humphrey Bogart in the leading man's role. You're gonna tell me that you're gonna hate on Harrison Ford?
We never, ever hate on Harrison Ford.
Exactly. So somehow we can accept Harrison Ford, as a stand-in for the Humphrey Bogart character. But yeah, we can't give somebody else a chance to play Captain Kirk and see how, he explores the contours of the character and makes that his own. And I don't know. I feel sorry for the people who are, actually kind of like just categorically dismissing it. And it always strikes me as being like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yes. And also the hate on for how the timeline changes things and how certain things are changed, such as the Spock Uhura relationship, the death of George Kirk, etc. But and the death of Amanda Amanda Grayson for that matter. But all of these things exist in order to make a different timeline and create something new, because otherwise it really is a reinterpretation of the same thing over and over again. I mean, I have to give mad props to the folks who are writing for the Kelvin timeline, and particularly Simon Pegg in this most recent film. I think did a masterful job. But it's not only because this is the familiarity that we've got, but there's something that's so brand new, shiny and brand new and wonderful about this. And what it is also doing is, be an older fan and be crotchety and yell at people to get off your lawn all you like, but which I do. Damn it, I'm keeping this ball, kids. But you gotta give some goddamn mad props for the fact that they are they're putting butts in the seats in the theaters, and those butts belong to young people. They are invigorizing. Yeah, there's a word. we're more neologisms today. It reinvigorates the fandom, and it turns it from folks in their 50s, 60s, 70s even. My father considers himself to be something of a casual fan. He's 85. And it starts to make this something cool for teens and tweens and something others. And that's the real next generation, folks.
Absolutely. And, you got to think about it. Those of us who were there, first or early, and there were fans who are older than me. I'm a syndication baby. I was born in 1970, so I was watching reruns on the local independent station. My mom would argue that, she radiated me with Star Trek through the womb, and she's probably right. My parents were fans, so
your first word was phaser,
Yeah, right. Funny story, total tangent, but totally worth it. When I was little, I was probably about 4 or 5, and, I had the night before Christmas memorized, and the whole thing about Santa coming through the chimney to deliver the presents.
Sure.
I was old enough and smart enough to ask my mom how Santa got into our house, because we had electric heat.
Okay.
And so, without missing a step, she told me Scotty beams him down.
Well, Scotty's a red shirt. This totally follows. And
I bought it, and I went back to playing, and, I'm sure, Mom breathed a sigh of relief with, not having to have the Santa Claus talk with me just yet. But, so Star Trek is very deeply embedded into my family life, my growing up. It's a family thing that my mom and I always did. So, I've been, even though I'm not old enough to have caught it back in the 60s, I might as well have, because it's been a part of, the fiber of my being forever. And I just kind of, it baffles me, because it's like, I can accept change. Why can't other fans?
Well, change is hard for a lot of people, and
I suppose
it's a comforting blanket in a lot of ways. One of the things that I've also noticed is, as I've gotten older and I've seen so many of these things over and over again, is to and maybe this is also because I write, so that where I'm seeing where there's sort of the seams, where they did something to save money, or they did something because they had to wrap everything up in the next 3 minutes. They just couldn't explore XYZ. And this is also why I started writing fan fiction, and it may very well have been why you did as well, where you see that there's some opening for something else, and it doesn't get explored. And you know why it doesn't get explored, because they didn't have the budget or they didn't have the time. I go back a bit further, because I'm born in 62, and I do remember watching what was probably either first run or first rerun, and my father liked it because it wasn't a Western on television. And I remember playing Star Trek with my brother. My brother's older than me. I had a little shirt that had like a little turtleneck, but there was a little V neck with it also. So I don't know, that just sort of like, to me that was my Star Trek shirt. But he also had like Major Matt Mason action figures and whatnot, and we watched Lost in Space too, which was on at this just pretty much the same time, because that was more for children, and because we were young. But I look at some of these things now and I say to myself, well, it was a really good idea, but the execution isn't necessarily as wonderful as it could have been. But at the same time, we're looking at this through glasses that are 50 years hence, and attitudes too, whether it's acting skills, not using the shatter comma kind of thing, or costume choices, maybe not to make the skirts quite so short, or that the aesthetic is too bright and seems a little too headache inducing and a little too 60s psychedelia, or whether we think that some of the storylines are throwing out casual sexism that maybe they shouldn't, but that's not necessarily fair, because it's a product of when it was created, but that doesn't mean that we can't reimagine. Although I guess some people feel that way. I wish they didn't.
Yeah. I think contextualizing things when they came out for the time that they came out is pretty important. There are some things, in terms of, let's say, sex and gender that maybe are downright cringeworthy about the original series, not the least of which is the miniskirt and go-go boot uniforms. But then I think to myself, if you look at the original pilot, The Cage,
yeah, they're wearing slacks.
The women and men are dressed exactly the same. So I kind of, I admit I could be fully wrong about this. It's been a long time since I've read about this period of Star Trek's history. But it seems to me that was a network decision and not a Gene decision. I think that the Star Trek Gene intended was for, equality between men and women.
I think that some more of this was network driven. Certainly, the moving of Majel Barrett from the second in command role to a far more traditional female type role of a nurse. When you look back on TOS, what are the three female characters? They're a receptionist, a nurse, and a secretary.
Right, but at the same time, though, you had the receptionist putting on coveralls and getting under her console and fixing it when stuff was getting screwed up.
Exactly.
And me absorbing that as a small child, that was significant, that was important, even though, like, the women in my world, which, aside from my mom and my grandma, they were like, the teachers, the secretaries, the nurses, that kind of thing. So that was absolutely the world at the time. But, we have to give it credit for being what we needed when we needed it.
And even though maybe I'm being dismissive about their roles, but at the same time, all three of those women were also single. So here they are, maybe they were a little bit beholden on men, but not too much. Even Rand, who kind of was intended to be sort of a sex symbol, and she's getting a little bit too close to the captain and then all of that. She was still independent enough. She had friends. She had a life outside of the bridge. Nurse Chapel, she has a fiance who she ends up rejecting. Uhura certainly rejects Sulu's advances. There are things that they do that give them a measure of independendence in a time period when that was rare and difficult and strange. In 1968, so just a little bit, just right in this time frame, I mean, it was hard to see women in some of these roles. When I was in third grade, which was a little bit later than that, my third grade teacher wanted to be called Ms., and that was a big deal in my school. It was a huge deal that she was Ms. And
I could imagine.
And wore pants. She wore slacks and she was Ms. And that was, people were up in arms. They thought that was, oh my God, the world was ending. And of course it did not.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know, like, how problematic fandom this was. I think we pretty much stuck to problematic fandom, but I think that we kind of, confined it to Star Trek, and apologies to people who are not fans of Star Trek, but it's kind of a very prominent and relevant example right now because of the rifts and the toxicity that is being caused in the Star Trek fandom right now, because the Kelvin universe is very polarizing in Star Trek fandom, as well as the lawsuit surrounding Axanar is also polarizing, and a lot of that polarization in terms of the fan film is entrenched in dismissal of and blind hatred for the Kelvin universe, J.J. Abrams' Star Trek films.
And for change, and for that it's a newer group, and that can be harder for people also to see their loved fandom changing. But
so do you think the pattern? Do you think the pattern will hold? That when the Star Trek Discovery TV series makes its debut, then they'll leave the Kelvin films alone and start hating on Discovery?
If it does, yeah, and always the first season stinks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but that's the same for any TV show too, though. My mentor back at my alma mater, Keith Dameron, he taught a class in writing for episodic TV, and he actually worked in Hollywood himself for a time. He's actually friends with David Gerald, believe it or not. So I have my 1 degree of separation there. He taught episodic screenwriting, which I took, and Keith, he worked on things that people actually watched. He was a writer producer on Sliders. He worked on Cleopatra 2525 and some other things. And so he explained the cycle of a show, whereas, the first season might be pretty good. It's usually the second season that gets really wobbly, because that's when they have to start changing things for the sake of changing them. And then if your show survives the second season, they'll realize that they shouldn't have tinkered with what they did, and a show will actually hit its stride around season 3.
Exhibit A, Star Trek Enterprise.
Well, and Star Trek The Next Generation. I mean, think about it. Like, I hated season 2. Well, I mean, there were some standout episodes, but if I had to say, okay, which season was the worst, I'm not even going to think about this. Season 2, yo.
Hands down. I don't even have to look at the other choices. That's it.
That's it. And this plays out in a lot of shows. A lot of shows do not even survive to season 3 because the season 2 retooling, as Keith called it, a lot of times would be enough to kill a show.
And that's interesting because you need to get to at least, I think more like a season 4 before you have enough for syndication where the real money is.
Right, because you can do what you call stripping, which is like showing it, 5 days a week and, not run out of episodes too soon. I think the minimum for that is 3 seasons, is what Keith said, but it might be 4 now because seasons are shorter.
Yeah, that makes sense. It used to be that you would see so many new shows, and now it goes over a fairly short amount of time, but then you get the hype for the rest of the year.
Yeah. So yeah, that there is an actual explanation for what you were describing there.
But and then jumping the shark, that's a whole other matter.
Oh yeah, well we can thank Fonzie for that.
Oh God.
Maybe we'll devote a show to Happy Days fandom.
The Happy Days fandom, no doubt. I'm sure that somewhere in the bowels of fanfiction.net there must be Happy Days /
I was just gonna say, if it exists, there's fan fiction for it, and if there's fan fiction for it, there's / for it.
And to circle back yet again to Trek, / is a term that was created by Star Trek fanfic writers, and it basically originally meant Kirk / Spock, and it was intended to be where people had created, where they wrote about a perceived relationship between the two characters. But we'll get into shipping, and we will get into fan fiction in much more detail on another show, because I think we're getting very close to the 2-hour mark. Is that right?
Probably. I don't know. I haven't been watching.
It's pretty close to it. And there's music and whatnot, and so I think you want to wrap up? We'll wrap up.
Yeah, we can wrap up. We've got to thank a lot of people.
Yes, we do. First off, Busy Little Beaver Productions and the G&T show, absolutely, for this marvelous opportunity. So thank you so much. We're so happy to be spinning off from you. The extraordinarily wonderful sound engineer, Michael J. Medeiros, who has shepherded us beautifully and has been so wonderful and patient with us. Our music is provided by
Invocation Array. Yeah?
And their members, Cerise and Kaylani. They are an independent band. They are on Bandcamp, and we will, of course, put their information into our show notes. And, of course, we want to thank our lovely announcer girl, Katie. We have the only announcer girl who has to take time off in order to learn fractions.
Actually, I should probably take time off to learn fractions too.
Ask Katie.
She could probably help me with that. Where was she when I was taking the GRE?
Katie's like 9, I think.
Right, well, she probably would have done better than me anyway on the math portion. But, I killed it on the verbal and the writing, though.
It got you where you are.
Who else do we need to thank?
Well, we'd like to thank our families and the people who love us, and of course, and God, the universe, our agents.
My mom, our number one fan.
Yay!
Yay, Mom! And especially thank you, Mom, for making me the Uber fan that I am. That kind of made my half of the show possible.
Thank you to my husband Jay, who has been my live audience today.
And thank you to my cats, Squiggy and Sherman.
Yay, Squiggy and Sherman!
For only walking on me once. While recording.
See, this could have been a much different show.
It could have been. All right, so be sure to follow us on Facebook. And do we have a Facebook address handy?
I think it's just Semantic Shenanigans, but we will put this into the show notes. We also have a Twitter stream, and that's the number 2 Shenanigans. And we are available. We are intending to be available on, this will be on YouTube, but we're also going to be on to iTunes, Google Play, and Mixcloud as soon as we can. And, we're also available via Smoke Signals and Semaphore, and possibly American Sign Language.
Yeah, and basically, if you can't find us, it's your fault. Because we're going to be so many places.
Just look for the pie, and you'll find us.
Pie.
Pie. Anyway, so thank you again, and we will, so the next time that we see you will be at the 24 Hours of GNT, which is going to be on October 29th and 30th. We have a time slot on the 29th, and we are going to be talking to the Women at Warp podcast, and we won't even tell you what the topic is, so it'll be a handy little nifty surprise.
I'm excited.
Yes, it should be a lot of fun, and of course that is their that is the annual fundraiser for Busy Little Beaver Productions, which of course we owe our very existence to. So yes. Once again, thank you, and we will see you real soon later this month. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. May the force be with you, and live long and prosper.
You said it all. Take it easy and get out and vote in November.
Vote.
Music provided by Invocation Array. Send mail to hosts@semanticshenanigans.com. Follow us on Twitter at 2shenanigans. That's the number, not the word. 2shenanigans. On Facebook, you can find us at Semantic Shenanigans. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Semantic Shenanigans. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time right here on Semantic Shenanigans.